Welcome to India Foundation Facebook interview series, a series where we identify and celebrate women pioneers in the field of cybersecurity. Today we have with us Neha. Neha covers technology policy for Business Standard, and before this she's been associated with some very big names such as the Economic Times, Reuters, the Hindu and the Money Control. She has closely analyzed and written on evolution of regulation of the technological industry for over the last decade and has broken several stories on employee impact, online privacy, data leaks, and policy changes. Welcome, Neha.
Hi.
Neha, my first question is that as a journalist, a lot of things must fall on your desk. How did you stumble upon cybersecurity? Was it something that just came to you, or was it a conscious choice?
I think it was a little bit of both. I'm an engineer by education.
Right.
I started working with an IT company. That was my first job. And then I got into journalism because, the thing I like to tell everyone is that I wanted to write in a language that I understand. So I started working in journalism, and then I was working with Reuters for a bit where I covered technology, and my background helped, of course, a little bit. By the time I came back, and this was in Bangalore, and then I returned to Delhi, and I was fortunate enough to, continue covering tech. And during the course of the coverage that I was doing at that time, cybersecurity is just something which I consciously, sort of decided to focus on because I could see that it's becoming more and more mainstream. There are more and more ways in which cyber threats are becoming part of our lives, and the challenge with tech reporting usually is to again write in a language that everyone understands.
I think that's a very, very big challenge.
Yeah. So of course, there's a lot to be reported on in the tech world, but I think a big part of a lot of the policy that we're seeing right now, and I started covering cybersecurity actively, I think only around 2014-15, and beginning from then, I think it was a little bit of what is that word? It was just good fortune for me that around that time we had all the issues around the encryption policy, and I'm sure you remember what happened there. So I covered all of those events very closely, and I think I just kind of really enjoyed covering some of those things, and that's how I got into covering cybersec.
That's interesting. So I think you've also been covering the Ministry of IT for a very long time now, and of course there's a lot of technological revolution that has happened in the last few years. How has covering the ministry been like? Did something change over the years? Did something become more sophisticated with the technological advancements, or has it largely been stagnant?
No, it hasn't been stagnant for sure, and I didn't cover the ministry in any other government, so I've only covered it from 2014. And even in these intervening years, I think the importance of the the IT ministry has largely become bigger or greater. Like when I started covering the IT ministry in 2014-15, the one sort of defining aspect of how people within the government also looked at IT. So, I don't know if you remember or not, but the IT ministry was actually a department earlier, right?
Yes.
So it became a ministry only in this government.
And it was quite a news that finally government is coming on forefronts about IT.
I did a story, I remember when the Digital India program was launched, amongst the 9 pillars, one pillar was that the IT ministry is going to be the nodal agency to coordinate certain things with all the big ministries, big line ministries. And it never took off because, a lot of ministries thought they're not going to deal with a small department. That has certainly changed. The other thing is that the IT ministry, the only thing is that within the IT ministry, there have just been very constant changes. Of course, we had, the same minister for a long time, but within the department, there have been many changes and, many different people.
It's becoming a little more sophisticated. People who know their stuff well are now being in the ministry, or is it?
No, I think the ministry has always had people who know their stuff.
Wow,
the only thing is that when there are changes very fast, it takes time for people to understand what's going on.
Right. That's true.
The thing is, I think the focus, I think they know what they want to focus on. But again, because people keep changing, it
Right.
just, you just have to start that cycle
It takes a
from the
longer
beginning.
while to see an
Yeah.
impact.
So by the time, you understand that this is the person who's going to deal with a certain thing, they move on to something else. So that becomes a problem. But largely, it's not difficult as such. But the ministry has certainly, I think it's become way more something that's taken way more seriously for sure. If you look at the mandate that they have, Aadhaar is under them.
Right.
Some of the biggest programs that we have, have a connect with the IT ministry, NIC, which does most of the government's work and development work that is attached to the
With
IT ministry.
That's
So
great. Having covered what are the priorities of sort of the Ministry of IT, what do you think are the top concerns or challenges that we're facing in India right now? So I'm sure you've covered IT for such a long time now. What do you think are the top more concerns that make the most frequent headlines in this country?
I think you'd have to talk about that in terms of which year you're talking about. But this has certainly been, this and the previous year, I think there's been a huge focus on what the big tech firms are doing. And that covers a whole gamut of areas. If you look at what a Google or an Amazon is doing, there's no area that they've not touched.
Right.
So rightfully, the Indian government, like governments in other parts of the world, is worried about how much control they have, control and access they have to your data. And that, I think has been the underlying theme or underlying issue that the government has been trying to focus on. I think that understanding of data especially after the Cambridge Analytica revelations, I think around that time, around 2018 or so, is when the ministry and across the governments, not just the IT ministry, I think data became sort of like an underlying theme across ministries.
Right.
So an example would be the first e-commerce policy that came out, e-commerce policy proposal that came out. It had like chapters and chapters on how your data is going to be saved and preserved, and so that I think that idea of putting the individual user in charge of their data, in charge of, and I think there is this tacit understanding that all data is now digital. That is something that really fascinates me, that we tend to forget that data is also physical. It is also analog, it is not all digital. But I think now by default, when you say data, everyone assumes it is digital data, because our lives are now evolving so fast around our smartphones.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think that just brings me to my next question also, that in the times of the pandemic, and of course hopefully now that we have entered in a post-pandemic world, technological dependence has increased massively. I think for every little aspect of our life, in one way or the other, we are dependent on technology. And if for nothing, then this pandemic made sure that we all become, we were forced to learn technology, I think, across all age groups. So how do you think are the different stakeholders protected in this? And I'm not talking about big firms, because somehow they always have the resources and the minds to protect themselves. But say I'm talking about an ordinary individual, people belonging to small and medium enterprises, or the society at large, because there was so much of WhatsApp consumption that was happening. How do you think we are prepared to deal with it? How protected do we feel about it? And basically, how do we see all these different stakeholders playing a role?
I think that's a really vast sort of dimension to cover, but I'll take a shot at it.
Yes.
So
we can go one by one. That's okay.
yeah. So at an individual level, that is a question that I also had in around, say, 6 years ago. These were the questions we were asking. So there were a lot of, and I know India Foundation, we were talking about how India Foundation also probably does a lot of these education campaigns, etc. But, earlier, around 5-6 years ago, like I was telling you, there were a lot of these campaigns before, I think, the Geo Revolution, when, people were going, there were lots of organizations that were working on digital literacy. And one of the questions that I would always ask is, so how do you, tell people that they can get into, cyber frauds are a thing. How are you going to, tell exactly, someone who's say selling bangles, if you're giving them access, if they have access to smartphones, which they will, which they inevitably do, and if they don't have it now, they will have it tomorrow. education is great, but how are you going to tell them
Mhm.
that you have to also be safe online? You know, there is
Right.
that aspect of safety. How are you going to demonstrate it to them? And I never got any good answers. But I think with the coming of, with cheaper data plans and the great big geo story and everyone actually getting access to smartphones, I think uh, the stories and anecdotes about people getting defrauded or duped, you would hear of, it's not a very nice thing to sort of know, but you will inevitably hear of someone losing money, for example.
Right.
And this is something that in our reporting, a lot of people, a lot of analysts also tell us, the best thing to, you know, grab attention or to put in a story is also show what monetary value your data has,
Right.
or what monetary loss you can suffer if you make a small mistake. All these campaigns, for example, around not sharing your OTP. Uh, you know,
I
if
think
you
it's
attach a
something that we've all fumbled at some point or the other.
absolutely, yeah. And so, these campaigns, of course, they may or may not make an impact, but if you hear of somebody who's gone through this unfortunate cycle, who's had to lose money,
Right.
so it just puts a tangible, sort of dimension to it.
Mhm.
So it's easier to kind of put across the point that being online is great, but it doesn't come without its
Demerits.
yeah, absolutely disadvantages.
I think
So
just speaking on digital literacy for a while, I think whenever we try and educate people to use electronic modes for different aspects of life, and then how even to protect themselves, I think there's also a very big window of how people use it to manipulate other people.
yeah.
To like you spoke about the OTP sharing,
Mm.
and I think at some point in time all of us had this random call which
Yeah.
asks us about our bank details, and at some time or the other we've always ended up giving them and having lost some money.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see this? How do you see the preparedness to sort of deal with this? Do you think people have largely become aware of it, or there is still a very big vacuum that needs to be filled in?
Again, this is a huge kind of dimension because in my
Mhm.
field of work, I will inevitably meet people who are more aware. So I
That's
will
true.
speak from that dimension.
Mhm.
But I often say my sort of the question that I usually ask about a thing like this is whether my parents would understand.
Right.
I think they do, and
Okay.
but then that also you have to keep in mind the fact that we are in an urban setting,
Right.
and we are probably heavier users of the online medium
Mhm.
than people in other places. But tier 2, tier 3 towns, business wise, there is it's just booming.
Yeah.
It's this digital revolution, or whatever people call it.
Mhm.
It's going to other markets. It's not just an urban phenomenon anymore.
Right.
So I think it just comes from usage, and the more you are online, the more difficult it is to not at least hear about something like this.
Right.
And also depends on who you're dealing with.
That's I think
Some
very important.
yeah, there will be people, and this is irrespective of age. I've seen people. It is not just older people. I think older people are way more savvy once they decide to start using something
Right.
digital, because there tends to be this thing that old people don't want to use, they're scared of technology, but they're not.
Right.
It just needs the right initiation, I think, and they're very savvy, and they want to be in the thick of things.
Yes.
I think sometimes young people are more sort of, maybe it's the arrogance of age that
They're apprehensive about a lot more
yeah,
things.
they are, they're just so scared or cynical that
Right.
they would rather not use say a digital payment mode than you
Than the
know
conventional.
a conventional one. And I've seen this in my family as well.
Right.
So just recently someone was telling me they don't use UPI because they're very scared of losing money. And
That's interesting to hear.
I would imagine, like, in my experience, UPI has been one of the safer modes to
Exactly. I think
make
it's been one of the
payments.
most convenient modes of
Absolutely,
payments
yeah.
where
You don't have to remember your account number. You don't have to remember anything.
that's true. Things have become a lot more easier with it. But I think that's very well said that it depends on the perception. So there's a huge population chunk that looks at it for the sake of
Yeah,
convenience.
yeah.
But I think there's a huge population that's still very skeptical about it, considering all the misinformation that's out there. So just picking up from there, in terms of what kinds of actions do we need to take, whether it's from the government or from private sector, whether we invest more in terms of say awareness, or do we need to pay a lot more focus on say policy, or do we need to pay a lot more focus on technology or innovation? How do you see prioritization of actions to be taken in this domain?
So if you take all three things, I think technology will always move at its own pace, which is now going at breakneck speed. I think it always has been, but now, there are so many more ways of doing conventional things that are coming in. Secondly, policy is never going to be able to keep up with the pace of technology.
Right.
By the time, and it's not because of a lack of desire. I think it's just that technology. I mean, there's so much happening.
Right.
And the government is well intentioned. They have, like for example, the cybersecurity policy. The last policy, if I remember correctly, we have is from 2013. There was an effort in 2019, end of 2019, inviting suggestions for the next cybersecurity policy of India.
Right.
So I think the window closed, and I don't think there's been a new policy yet. And again, policy can only do so much. It can't cover everything, and it can't touch everything. What is that word that it's prescriptive, right? It can't give you the solutions to all problems. So policy is probably going to be, and from the tech community, that's always been the demand, that you have light touch policy and let business grow. And India does have a huge tech community that's doing new things, and it's just that coming back to that question of whether people understand the risks, etc. I think people go one step further, and they find the loopholes that they can exploit in a technology first, which is where cyber security becomes kind of like the overriding sort of principle. But in terms of how we can, how we can look at it, is maybe look at the more vulnerable groups first. So of course there are lots of organizations, lots of people who work with women, who work with children, who work with maybe even senior citizens. I've seen there are these things that RWAs will organize, and they'll tell you how not to get duped online, etc. So maybe focus on that, but until you get into the thick of things, I think it really doesn't kind of you can't understand unless you're using a certain kind of technology.
I think just coming to the policy bit, for I think that will be the last segment for the interview as well. We have a habit of saying, like when I say we, most of us have this habit of saying that we need to be more proactive in terms of writing the policy. In technology, I think you cannot really foresee a lot. I think nobody could foresee what happened in the last 2 years during the pandemic and the kind of dependence that increased. So I think, do you think that we can actually think in advance and make more proactive policies in the larger domain of cyber? Or do you think we need some kind of a collaboration of policy makers and scholars and people who are developing these policies, so that there can be like a simultaneous ecosystem of protecting and preserving things along with development? How do you see this?
I don't know what is a good answer to this, honestly, but like I said, policy, the whole aspect of tech policy formation in India has changed over the last few years. So it has been consultative, it has been, they've taken a lot of feedback, like for the social media and digital ethics code that came out earlier this year. There was, some amount of public consultation, but it wasn't like it pleased everybody. So eventually it didn't work out. If you look at the data protection bill, for example, which is stuck at the bill stage for a long time. So, that aspect of talking to everyone, taking everyone on board exists even now. But again, technology moves really fast if you're doing this in a consultative model, unless you have policy which can be tweaked in real time, which is I think we're just light years away from that.
I think that's next to impossible.
That's next to impossible, because technology changes really fast. Say in an e-commerce segment, because I believe everyone would understand that example. You would think that there is only a marketplace model and an inventory model. But now there are so many different ways people are bringing commerce to people. Now there's
Right.
social commerce, there's video commerce.
Mhm.
They will have aspects of marketplaces and inventory. So
Right.
how do you, so just classifying these things becomes so difficult.
Right.
You can't, even if you want, it becomes very difficult to keep pace.
Right.
Like a Google, for example, is not just a search engine.
Mhm.
Google does a lot more.
Lot
I don't
more
think
than
even Google can, if you ask one person at Google, they will not be able to tell you what they do across the board.
Right.
So technology is just moving very fast, and so policy, maybe a good way to think about it would be maybe keep a broader vision for the end goal that you have.
Right.
And coordination between departments, I think, is a given. You can't not coordinate in a tech scenario.
Right.
By default, that is something that you have to do if you want to enforce whatever it is that you're doing. But I think the policy makers, they have their heart in the right place.
Right.
It's just that there are just some things that you can't keep control. Yeah, absolutely.
I think on that note, we'll end this interview. I'm sure there's a lot that needs to be done in the domain of technology and cyber world, and not everything is lost either. So I think on that optimistic note, that things will be better from here on as well. I think we'll call this interview now. Thank you so much
Thank you so
for
much.
joining us, Neha.
Really nice talking to you.
Same here.